Hey, what's happening guys? In this video, we're going to connect Reframe with Firebase. It's going to be awesome. Here we go. Cool, yeah. So the first thing I want to do is create a Reframe application, and on the Culver.io website, there's a cool way, there's basically a guide on how to set up Reframe with Culver, so I'm going to follow that. The first thing I want to do is get the Reframe template, and to use this, we need Line-Again, so make sure you have Line-Again installed. There's a link down below on how to install it. Let's create a new Reframe project. So I'm just going to go to my terminal, paste this in. I'm going to call this Reframe with Firebase. Super quick to make. Cool. Once it's done, we can CD into it, clear this, and I'm going to open it in VS Code. Cool. Once that's open, there are a few dependencies I want to just install off the bat. The first one is refrisk, and this will allow us to inspect the database for Reframe. So it's kind of like, like a Redux inspector. So let's copy this, and we go to shadow CLJS, and we'll paste it in our dependencies. And then we also need to add this to a preload. So here we go here, and it's added to our preloads for under DevTools. And I think that's done. Cool, we don't need this anymore, so I'm going to close it. I also want to install Promiser or Promiser, and what this will do is, because we're working with Firebase, there are a lot of promises, and this will just make that process, working with the promises, a lot easier. So I'm going to copy this and add it also as a dependency. Save that. Then I'm going to open up the terminal again, and what I want to do is install Firebase. And we need Firebase because this whole project is going to be using it. And lastly, I want to also just add this Sakura classless CSS framework. I'm just going to use the CDN. This will just style our application natively without having to add in classes. It's just nice for projects like this. Cool, and under title, we'll just add our link to the Sakura CSS. Then I want to make a Firebase application. Cool, so I'm just going to call this Reframe with Firebase. Cool, it is what it is. Continue. Cancel. Continue. Let's use my default account. Create project. Cool. While that's creating the project, I'm just going to go back here to VS Code. Cool. We've installed Firebase and all our packages. Now I want to start this project using Culver. So all we need to do there is open our command line palette and say Culver start a project and connect. We're going to select the project type as shadow CLJS. The build is going to be app. And cool. It's going to download our dependencies. Once that's done, we want to connect to the app build, and we can go to localhost 8280 and see if this is working. Let's refresh. Doesn't seem happy. Let's inspect console 404. Okay, I don't know what was going on there, but it's working now. And if we open up this, we can see we have access. This is refrisk, and we can see that we have a name field in our database with the value of Reframe. Let's go and change that. So if we go back into our project, we'll go to source DB, and here we have that name field with the value of Reframe. Let's change that to food list. Save that. If we go back, cool. We need a refresh for that to update, and cool, we have our new database value there. And let's just check if we can evaluate something in our REPL. So just underneath here, I'm going to go +1 and press Control Enter to evaluate this. 2, cool. Everything's connected, everything is working. Let's save this. I'm going to close. No, actually, I'll keep that open for now. Let's close all of this. Let's close this. Let's go back to Firebase where we were creating our project. It's now ready. And what we want to do here is we want to add a web app. Cool. So let's call this food list web. And let's register that app. Cool, so we've installed Firebase, so we don't need to do that, but we do need to initialize our app. So we need to import firebase.app into our application. So let's do that. And I'm gonna make a new namespace here. So in reframe with Firebase, I'm gonna create a new folder and I'm gonna call it Firebase. And then I'm gonna create a new file here and I'm gonna call it init.cljs. And this is where we're gonna initialize Firebase. So let's save this and let's just minimize this on the side. And Culver has put this here for me, which is awesome. And let's require Firebase. So we can require Firebase by using this require macro. And we want to go here. We want to include this Firebase app. Let's do that. And I want to include this as Firebase. Save this and evaluate this to make sure that all worked. Cool. So now we should have access to Firebase. So if I write comment and we just print line Firebase and control enter on this, we see we have the Firebase object and all the functions and objects that are attached to that. Cool. We're getting somewhere. Let's just close this output so we have more space. Let's initialize this app. So I'm going to create a new function here. I'm going to call it init. And basically what we want to do here is, if we don't have a Firebase app, let's make one. So essentially what we're going to say is, when there are no apps, so when equals 0, the length, so we can use a length to get the length, and Firebase has a function called getApps. Whoa. Let's open up our output again and scroll down to our Firebase object, and we can find the function here called getApps. And it's a function and it basically returns our apps, and we want to say, if we don't have any apps, let's initialize it. So Firebase get apps. When 0, that's when we want to initialize our app. Current line, we'll just say initialize Firebase. And to initialize Firebase, let's go back to the docs. We need to pass through this config here. So I'm just going to copy this. And we need to pass it to this initialize app function. So we can call Firebase initialize, gotta spell it right, app. Did I spell it right? I don't trust myself. I'm just going to copy that object here, save it, and copy this function name, paste it here, just to make sure that that's not going to be an issue. Cool. Then I'm going to, thanks Copilot. We need this hashtag JS to convert this map into a JavaScript map. And of course, we also need to put the colons on the left-hand side. So let's just do that super quick. Save, and we don't need any of these commas. Cool, and this should work for our init. So I'm going to define this function. Let's just go back here, continue to console, make sure that our app is here. So I'm just going to refresh this. Cool, here's our food list web app. This app is going to basically be, we're going to log in and we're going to have a list of food, and we're going to be able to add more food items to that list. It's going to be very cool. So let's go back here and evaluate this function. And now we can, in our comment block, run it. Cool, and it returns us, basically, it initializes the Firebase app, and if we run it again, we get null because the app already exists. So now let's get started with auth. And to do that, I'm going to go to the docs on authentication, and authenticating using Google with JavaScript, that's what we want. We want to use this Google Auth provider. So let's import that so long. So we can go here, we can go add that as a dependency, Firebase auth, and we want the Google Auth provider. So I'm just going to refer to that. Refer, that's it, Google, let's just copy paste it out so we don't have spelling mistakes. Let's evaluate this to make sure it's all good. Cool. So just to show you that we have that, we can print line and evaluate this, check our output out. And here we have our Google Auth Provider object. Awesome, let's go back here and let's see how we use that. Cool, so I want to use this sign in with pop-up. So we click a button, we get a pop-up, we sign in, and we're logged in. Let's get it done like that. So I'm going to go back to our project, and underneath here, I'm going to define a function, and I'm going to call it Google sign in, and it's going to take no arguments. And let's just see how we do this here. So we want to get the sign in with pop-up function, and it's also from auth. So we want to grab both of these, get auth and sign in with pop-up, because we're going to need those. So let's import them here, get rid of this comma, save this, evaluate this. And I'm just going to get rid of these comments because you don't really need them. It was just to demo that they were working. And inside of here, I'm going to create a let binding, and I want to bind, and I want to add the provider. And the provider is going to be this, this Google Auth provider. So how does this work? We need to pass the provider here. So let's create a new provider. So Google Auth provider, that's how we create a provider. And that comes from here. So basically we're doing this new Google Auth provider with this Google Auth provider dot syntax. And then we need our auth. If we go back down, we need to call get auth, and we can just call get auth by running get auth. And now we have our provider and our authentication. So now we want to call sign in with pop-up and pass through our auth and provider. So let's do that. In our let binding, we'll go sign in with pop-up. We'll pass through our auth and our provider. Cool, let's evaluate this function and let's put it in a comment. So Google sign in, and I think if we evaluate this, we'll see it in our front end. So I'm going to execute it. Yeah, and then did you see that? Let's run it again. Man, I'm just going to refresh this app. Cool, let's evaluate this namespace, evaluate our init function, and then evaluate this Google sign-in function, and then run init. So we've initialized Firebase, and if we run Google sign-in, we get the pop-up. It is breaking though. Auth configuration not found. Okay, cool. I forgot about that. We actually need to set up authentication with Google inside Firebase. Let's go back to our project, and let's see how we do this. We need all products, authentication. Get started. We're going to use the Google provider. Then we click enable, support email. I'm just going to use my email address, save. Cool, now Google authentication is enabled. I think that's pretty much it. Let's run this Google sign in. We should get a pop-up again. Let's refresh this and see what happened there. Then we can evaluate this whole file. Evaluate file. Evaluate from start to file to cursor. Yeah, run init. Cool, and then run this. Cool, the authentication there is working. Well, we can sign in, but we haven't signed in yet. So basically what I want to do is after we sign in with our pop-up, I want to set a user inside of our reframe DB. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to wait for this promise to resolve. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the on-auth state change event that Firebase provides. So if we go back to Firebase, let's go to manage users. So click manage users, and I want to use this on-auth state changed function, which gets the user. If it has the user, I want to save it in reframe. Otherwise, I want to set the value in reframe to null. So let's import this on-auth state changed function and add it here to the top, on-auth state changed. And I'm actually going to, after we initialize the app, I want to provide the handler for this. So we'll call on-auth state changed. And what does this take? This takes auth, so we can call get auth here. and then it takes a function which gets the user. So basically takes a function with the user as the argument. And here basically we want to store this user in reframe. So we'll check if there is a user, we will find user, and that will be our user. Otherwise, we will set our user value to null. Set user to null. Cool beans. So let's reevaluate our init function. Let's refresh our app. So cool. Now we can use this thing again. Evaluate from starter file to cursor. So now we've evaluated everything. Let's run init. So we've initialized Firebase. And if we actually sign in with the user, so I'm going to call Google sign in. I'm going to sign in with my account. Then we should see on console, okay, it sets the user to null initially because we don't have a user. Then it wants to store the user, and here we have our user object. So I'm going to make another function in this file, and I'm going to call it store user. And it's going to take this user object that we get back. Keep in mind this is a JavaScript object. I'm just going to keep using it as a JavaScript object for simplicity. So here in this function, I want to create a reframe event, which when we fire, it will store the user inside our reframe DB. So I'm going to open the side panel, and under events, I'm going to make a new database event. So let's go reframe. Oh man, all of this autocomplete. Reg event DB, and I'm going to call this event set user, and it's going to have a function. So we need the database, and here we're going to destructure the event array. So the first thing is going to be the event name, which we're not going to use, but I'm going to just leave it here for clarification in case you don't know what it is. And the next part is going to be the user. And what we want to do is we want to return our database, that we want to associate in that database a new user. And that user will be the user that we pass through. Save this. And here we want to fire off that event. So we're going to need to dispatch that event using reframe. So from reframe, let's import reframe.core. We want to import the dispatch function, dispatch. And we'll call that here. So we want to dispatch that event, and dispatch takes in a vector with the event name and the value that we're passing through. So we don't have the event name yet, but the value will be, well, let's do this. We'll create a let binding here because we want to, if there is a user, we want to extract the map out of it. Otherwise we just want the value to be null. So we'll say, I don't know, user to store, and we'll say if user, it'll be a value, otherwise it will be null. And then we want to store this user to store. And let's just import our event quickly before this gets a bit too confusing. So we want to import this events namespace, and we want to import this set user event. So from our project, what's it, reframe with firebase.db, .events, import this as events, and then we can colon events / set user, and this is how we link to this keyword. Cool. So we obviously need to put this inside of our let binding. And we need to set the user to a map if we have it. So if there is a user, it's this map, otherwise it's null. And this map will just have, I don't know, a UID, and we can extract the UID by getting the property UID from the user, and we want a display name. I'm just going to say name, and that will be the display name from our user. save this, evaluate this, and instead of printing store user, let's actually store this user. So store user, and let's put this above this function so it can use it. So we actually don't need this second, we don't need this whole if statement because it's being handled in store user. So I'm gonna just get rid of this and just call store user with our user. Evaluate this, evaluate our store user function, and run our Google sign in function again. So now if we sign in, go back to our application, open up refrisk, should see an event fire. We don't see it fire, and that's because we haven't reinitialized our Firebase instance because we're exiting early based on this. So what I'm gonna do is just refresh our app, go here, refresh. And now actually, instead of like evaluating this by hand, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to our core.cljs, and this is where our initial project just gets set up. So after setup, I'm just gonna call, well, what I wanna call is Firebase init. And now I wanna import this Firebase init function from this init namespace. So let's go here, and we'll go from reframe with Firebase.Firebase.init, and I'm going to call this as fb. So now if we click through to here, it's going to call this function every time we refresh our app. Maybe if we just put it before this. Cool, I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I restarted my REPL and it seemed to work. So now if we just refresh and we go back to firebase.init.cljs and we execute this Google sign-in function, we should be able to sign in. Then it will execute this on auth state changed, get auth, store user, and we should have our user in our table. Let's see. Cool, and we do have our user here, and we have the UID and the name of the user. Cool, so now what I want to do is, when the user is signed in, I just want to view like the user detail just as a map on the screen, just so we can see what we have. So I'm going to go to views.cljs, and I'm going to copy this subscription here. We haven't made the new subscription, but it will follow along the same lines. Instead of fetching the name, I want to fetch the user. And instead of subscribing to the name, I'm going to subscribe to the user. So every time the user changes, this component will update. And let's actually just create that subscription. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And we're going to fetch the user, and that user is in the user key of our database. So if we go here, this is where the user sits. And we can go back to our view, and let's render some hiccup that, when we have a user, and this is how we dereference our user. So you have to use the @ symbol when calling a subscription. When we have a user, and I can just show you the user from the DB. If we evaluate this, we can see we get a reagent atom. So if you're familiar with atoms, you know the ref and the derefing. I have a video on that. Let's create a div here using hiccup, and we'll say the logged in user is, and we'll pass through the value of that user. Cool, and now we can see that we have that value. Cool, so now what I want to do is when we refresh the app, we'll have no user, but we're still logging in, but then we have a user. So I just want to add that loading state. So if we go to DB, I'm going to add a new key here. I'm going to call it, say, user loading, and I'm going to set it to, let's set it to true. And we can actually add a question mark here to indicate that this is a Boolean value. And then in our event, when we set the user, we can set user loading to false, because we know what the value is. And then in our views, we can subscribe to that. So let's go down here, and we'll have loading, and we can subscribe to user loading. Let's just create that subscription. And we'll pull the user loading field from our database. So we could say it's when at loading. Yeah, when loading, we'll just have some text. Let's put in a div. We'll say loading. Let's say when loading. When loading, and then we also don't have a user. So, and not user. Now if we refresh this, we'll see loading, and then we should see the logged in user. Cool, so now what we need to do is be able to log the user out. So to do that, I'm going to create a button. Well, we don't even have a button to log in the user. Let's create a button to log in and log out the user. But let's first do the log out button so we can actually log out. So when there is a user, let's also create a logout button. So I'm going to put this inside a div also. So we'll have a button here, and it will have the text log out, and it will call the logout function that we don't have. So let's create that logout function. This init namespace could probably be divided into init and auth, but I think this is fine. Let's define call it sign out. Sign out, and let's see how we sign out a user on Firebase. So here we can see in the auth package, there's a sign out function. So I'm just going to import that. And to call it, let's just copy this. You just call sign out and pass through the auth. So all we need to do is call sign out and pass through our auth, and call get auth. And let's use that function here. So we'll make a function where on this button on click handler, on click, what we want to do is we want to call a function which calls that sign out function. Cool, and we need to import it. So let's import from reframe, what we call this project with Firebase. And from Firebase dot init, we want to import that sign out function. So now if we go back to our page, we should see that button. And if we click this, yeah, we won't see anything. We don't have a user, we're not loading, we just have nothing. Now what we want to see is a login button. So let's change this to an if. This will be the logged out state. So we'll create a div here. And we'll say div, you are not logged in, and we'll just copy this button. Here we want to use that sign in with Google button. So if we go to init, we had Google sign in. This is the function we want to call when you click this button. Back to our view. Cool, Google sign in, we'll import that function here. Go back here, you are not logged in. If we log in, we should see our pop-up. Can sign in. Cool. We click logout. Awesome. Now we have Firebase auth in our application. In the next video, I want to show how we can store data inside Firebase and use that with Reframe. So catch you in the next one, guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. Cheers. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe.